Okay, let's talk about strengths and weaknesses. As you can see, I needed to get my cup of coffee and didn't have as much coffee this morning as I usually do, so I'm feeling the need for that. So, strengths and weaknesses. One of the things that I've seen rather regularly in students' analysis of strengths and weaknesses is, a strength might be this article was easy to read, or a weakness, this article was hard to read. That's not really a strength or weakness. That's an opinion about your relative comfort or a student's relative comfort with this particular assignment, one over another. A strength or a weakness has to do with substance in the article. Has the writer, if they made their point, have they built into the fabric of the article logical consistency and a strength of argument? Let me put it this way. Let me tell you a story from when I defended my dissertation. One of my professors, very dear man to me, named Dr. John Schmidt. Dr. Schmidt, at my dissertation defense, in fact, I had done a directed study with Dr. Schmidt, and I was planning on writing my dissertation about animal imagery in the book of Isaiah, especially in Isaiah 11. But it was in my class with Dr. Schmidt. It was a Hebrew reading class, a directed study, and I noticed something in the text, and that ended up being my dissertation topic. So I had a lot of affection for Dr. Schmidt, beside the fact that he was just a wonderful man, and very respectful of everyone around him, very inclusive. So for me, as a non-Catholic in a Catholic institution, that was really important. In any event, Dr. Schmidt said at my dissertation defense, "Well, John, I don't know that you've convinced me, but you've made a good argument." See, that is what we're doing in theology. We recognize that there are all kinds of ways of looking. Like for me, I'm a biblical studies guy, right? So looking at a biblical text, there are all kinds of ways to see that text. I am interested in a strength or a weakness in a writer's argument. So here are some ideas, and as I said, this document is going to be posted. You'll have it already on the course websites. For evaluating strengths and weaknesses, you might want to ask questions like this. Does the writer stay consistent with the thesis? That is, the writer has a thesis. Has he or she written in such a way that it supports that thesis? If it doesn't, one of two things. Either it's poor writing. Typically, that's not the case when they're published in journals. Or B, it could be the case that you have not correctly identified the thesis. And when I say you, I mean you very inclusively, all of us. If I think the writer's going one way and I read that article and I'm like, what's going on here? I may have to go back to the introduction and say, maybe I was off base. Or it may be the case that the writer just includes so much auxiliary, let's call it that, material, that the thesis and the proving of the point gets lost in there. And of course, that might be rather a consistent critique that those outside of my discipline have for an article. So just be careful. That one can be that can be too easily seen as a critique. So just read very carefully there, because I wouldn't want that to be kind of a default. Well, I got lost, so he must or she must not have stayed consistent with the thesis. Maybe not, and that speaks to a kind of an organizational question. Thesis and organization for proving said thesis. So think about that. You might want to ask, is there a logical progression in the article? In other words, A, B, C, and B builds on A, and C builds on B? Is there that kind of logical progression? And I don't want to assume that it should be or shouldn't be. It may be that the writer is bringing three different things together, and we've already had an article or two like that. So is there a logical progression? If there's not a logical progression, is that intended, or is it a mistake? And if it's intended, maybe the writer figures in the final conclusion, I'll wrap all this up. So be thinking about those kinds of things. Probably should have put this one first, but simply, does the article prove its point? If it has a thesis, which typically they will, sometimes not, or sometimes it's cloudy, but typically they will, does the writer prove the point? Yes, no, and then you can start ruminating, well, if not, why not? If so, how so? Remember, with strengths and weaknesses, I'm almost always going to want you to be thinking about why you think that. And that may be something that comes down a little later in the critique of the article, though you may introduce it a little bit here in the strengths and weaknesses sections. Pardon me. You might ask, are the sources upon which the writer builds the argument reliable ones? So if you've got an academic article, and all the sources are from the New York Times or the Washington Post or the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, my hometown newspaper, and it claims to be a biblical studies article, then I'm going to say, well, wait a minute, are those the right sources for this kind of article? May or may not be, depends on what the thesis is and what the writer's trying to prove. But typically for biblical studies, I'm going to want the writer to be able to dialogue with the biblical text and with the relevant secondary literature, commentaries, articles about the text, monographs or books about the text, that kind of thing. So how good are the sources? Are they good ones or the bad ones? Now you're coming from outside my discipline, right? So you may not know. And so the same thing for me, when I go to read sources, read articles or books outside of my own discipline, I may not know who the best writers are, who are the most influential writers, but I can tell if a writer is using quality resources as opposed to Wikipedia or some other website, for example, or some publisher that's not a reputable publisher. There are things like that that you can look at. Does the writer use a style that makes it harder or easier to read and or comprehend the ideas presented? Now this goes back to something I mentioned earlier, where sometimes students will say, well, this was easy to read or hard to read. I want us to make sure that you understand what I mean here by this particular question. Hard to read and easy to read, those are it would be pretty easy to default outside of your own discipline. Well, this was hard to read. Is it hard to read because you don't have the background, or is it hard to read because the author used convoluted language? If the language is convoluted, then I might also say, well, was this article written in 1935 and English language has changed since then? That may be the case. So the date of the article may make a difference, in which case it's not the writer, it's me. I live in 2018. And yet there are times, even when you're in the discipline, that you find that writers, you find that their language is difficult, needlessly so, because of the way they write. One of the critiques about my own writing for my dissertation was that it was a little repetitive. It was. And I struggled with that because I thought I had to keep building the case. I probably erred on the side of repetitive, where I should have just assumed my academic readers had gotten the point, very quickly. So a final question: is the article organized well, or is it organized poorly? And for that one, that's really kind of important. You have a thesis. The author's got an agenda. How well does that author bring that off? is there organization, or does it seem like a kind of a mishmash? Think about those things when you're working on the strengths and weaknesses area of the article.